Hello friends, our topic is basic foreign trade. Basic foreign trade starts with trade itself. In trade, there is a buyer and a seller. For a commercial activity to begin, the buyer and the seller must make a contract between themselves. First, a marketing activity must take place, and after the marketing activity, they need to make a contract. In this contract, details such as the type of goods, how the goods will be sold, and the methods of delivery must be specified. When we talk about basic foreign trade, we need to start with the contract first. The contract needs to be detailed, and it should include dispute resolution authorities. All matters must be included in the contract. There are two main important issues here. One of them is how the goods will be delivered and how the payment for the goods will be made. Special attention should be paid to these two aspects. However, it is not enough to just write these in the contract. It is also necessary to know these to understand how they work and how they are implemented. Now, more importantly, these are ultimately matters of trade. They can take place domestically as well as internationally. That is why we call trade with foreign countries international trade or foreign trade. For this, it is necessary to know certain rules. In fact, the rules of trade should not only be applied to foreign trade, but the same rules should also be applied in domestic trade. When we look at the rules of trade, it is necessary to know the rules of trade. These are the rules for payment methods and for methods of delivery of goods. In fact, there are also international rules for contracts and for interbank payments as well. When we talk about international rules, we also need to define what international rules are. Who owns them? We need to mention these. International rules are rules that can be applied everywhere, all over the world, to all trade transactions. And these are also the rules for payment methods and for methods of delivery of goods. The rules for methods of delivery of goods are called Incoterms. These are the short three-letter terms we hear, like FOB, CIF, DDP, DDU. These are the rules for delivery of goods in international trade, methods, and commercial terms. In addition to these, there are also some rules related to payments. These include the UCP rules for letters of credit and also the URC rules, or more commonly known as ICC Publication Number 522 for the Documentary Collection Payment Method. These are also international rules related to payments. Now, if there are such international rules, of course, there must be an author or an owner of these rules. When we look at this, we encounter an institution called the ICC. ICC stands for the International Chamber of Commerce. Its headquarters is in Paris. It was founded in 1919. It has more than 45 million members. It has national committees in more than 170 countries. It is quite a large organization. It is a private business organization. It was established in 1919 after the First World War. Its purpose is to prevent and eliminate the devastation caused by the war and to enable people to trade easily. And for this purpose, this organization, which was founded in Paris by a group of entrepreneurs and some people who called themselves ambassadors of peace and ambassadors of trade, later spread throughout the world via national committees. They put trade on the table and tried to eliminate whatever problems existed in trade. And one of these was the establishment of rules. In other words, trade cannot be conducted or sustained without rules. To make this possible, they first looked at the aspect of rules and tried to understand how trade had been conducted up to that point in history. Up until that period, that is, until 1919. And in fact, it was only in the 1930s that this could actually become operational. They were able to address such matters. They determined that, until the 1930s, trade was conducted based on customs, traditions, and habits. And here, the first thing the ICC did was to turn these customs, traditions, and habits into formal rules. For this purpose, draft texts were prepared first. They identified where rules were needed. After these needs were determined, draft texts were created, working groups were formed, and as a result, the first rule drafts emerged. These were later sent to the national committees. The national committees put them to a vote using their country's votes, and as a result, these were accepted as rules. And trade all over the world began to be conducted according to these rules. As we mentioned, rules such as UCP, ISBP, ISP, and URDC are rules. Ultimately, they are not laws or statutes. However, they are only valid if the parties choose to use them. They become binding for the parties, and using them is done either by including them in the contract or by adding them to undertakings such as letters of credit, guarantees, or standbys. However, this is the way they are used. So after summarizing the rules, it means that there are rules for foreign trade. We need to be aware of these rules and use them everywhere for our own business, our own interests, and our own benefit. They are not like laws. Using the law is not optional. It is mandatory to use the law, and people cannot avoid it. They are obliged to do everything in accordance with the law, but rules are not like that. Rules are used for ourselves because we adopt them, and when both parties accept them, they choose to use them. That is why there is a difference between rules and laws, and we should not confuse them. In practice, we see that these are often confused. Therefore, it is necessary to use them correctly and appropriately according to the situation. What is important here is to know these rules very well. This is just like it resembles football. Football is also an international game. It is played both domestically and abroad. However, as you can see, it has its own rules. Sometimes these rules, we create them ourselves. With this, we can play a game like a neighborhood match. Or we can play this game according to the rules prepared by FIFA or the rules prepared by IBAF. And of course, when we play an international match, we have to play this game according to the IBAF rules, which are internationally and universally accepted. Otherwise, if we use the rules from a neighborhood match and say, let's play this match. Let's say we're playing a match with Russia or Brazil. Let's do it with them using the neighborhood match rules. It won't work. The same applies in business as well. In other words, when doing business, you need to follow its rules, even universal rules, international rules, the accepted rules of the ICC. Otherwise, if we try to do business using the very simple methods we use among ourselves domestically, we won't be able to do it at the international level. This is the rules side of the matter. When we look at the situation starting from the contract, we also need to know the methods and techniques regarding how the goods will be delivered and how the payment for the goods will be made, as we mentioned before. For this, when it comes to methods of delivery, the more commonly known term is Incoterms. It is necessary to know the Incoterms rules and the terms within them. We need to know and apply rules such as FOB, CIF, DDP, DAT, and DPU. So, how are we going to apply these? We will use them by writing them into the contract. For example, if I'm going to send goods to my customer and I'm the one organizing the transportation and arranging the insurance, and my customer is in a distant country, then I should prefer a commercial term like CIF. However, if I am still in the position of exporter and I am going to deliver the goods at my own location, then we should prefer a delivery term from the F group, and accordingly, my customer on the other side will send the means of transport to me. I will then deliver the goods to that means of transport at my location, and in this way, they will be shipped. From the point I deliver the goods, the risk and responsibilities should pass to the buyer. Of course, it is necessary to learn these rules in detail. Each commercial term has its own specific method and way of operation. There are transfers of risk and damage. It is important to know these. In other words, to use them successfully, you need to know these and also write them correctly in the contract. When we look at payment methods, there are also 4 very basic payment methods that have existed since ancient times. These are selling goods for cash, selling on credit, making immediate payment, and selling on credit terms. It is also a method where a third party intervenes to guarantee or secure a payment, and the sale is made using this method. So, in the end, we have 4 basic payment methods. In addition to these, there can also be alternative payment methods that emerge from time to time with the help of technology. These can also be used depending on the need or the situation. But ultimately, there are 4 basic payment methods that have existed from ancient times to the present day. One of these is the cash or upfront payment method. Another is the payment against goods method, and the other is the payment against documents, also known as collection or remittance. And the last one is what we call a letter of credit, a payment method in which a bank is involved and guarantees the payment. We refer to this method as a letter of credit. Now, if we elaborate a bit on these payment methods, the cash payment method is an extremely simple payment method. There are 4 parties involved in every payment method. In fact, there are essentially 2 main parties here. There are 2 parties, the buyer and the seller. In addition to these, banks may also be involved. Depending on the situation, these banks can act as parties or simply as intermediary institutions. Therefore, we need to address this topic by considering the buyer, the seller, the buyer's bank, and the seller's bank. In other words, when explaining a payment method, it should be approached in this way. The buyer and the seller make a contract between themselves. First, after finding each other as customer and supplier, they make a contract, and in this contract, they specify one of these payment methods. Let's assume that one of these payment methods is advance payment. Let's start with that first. When they specify the advance payment method, the buyer must send the money to the seller in advance, and the seller must prepare the goods and send them to the buyer. It is a payment method that is this simple. In this payment method, the buyer is seriously at risk. In what way is it risky? Because the buyer will send the money. It is not certain whether the goods will arrive or not. It is a situation that is entirely at the seller's discretion. Now, when we look at this, we basically see that the buyer is taking on a risk. As for the seller, we understand that they are more comfortable because they received the money in advance and are then supposed to send the goods accordingly. Of course, this can be made more secure here. With additional assurances, such as guarantees or standbys, what can be done? The buyer can request a guarantee in advance. The seller can provide a guarantee through their bank, and after that, the money can be sent in advance based on that guarantee once it has been received. And if the transaction is not completed, that is, if the goods are not shipped, the buyer may be able to claim the goods under that guarantee or standby. In this way, the advance payment method becomes a bit more secure, and this is essentially how simple the advance payment method is. In fact, the ICC has reviewed this and did not even see the need to write rules for it. It stated that it is extremely simple, merely a money transfer, and therefore saw no need to establish any rules for it. Another payment method we have is payment against goods. This is a payment method that is exactly the opposite of the advance payment method. In the payment against goods method, unlike the advance payment method, the seller's risk is higher here. In advance payment, the buyer's risk was high, but here the seller's risk is high, because in the end, the seller ships the goods and it is uncertain whether the payment for the goods will be received. There is no guarantee whatsoever. The buyer needs to act in good faith, and if the payment is made in good faith, then the transaction is completed. But if the payment is not made, the seller assumes the risk of the goods sent and cannot receive the payment. Theoretically, we need to know it this way. So, is it possible to make this more secure and reliable with certain methods? Yes, it is also possible to make this secure with standby letters of credit, guarantees, and insurance. In fact, in some cases, it may also be necessary to use factoring. With such additional guarantees, this payment method can also be made secure. The ICC has also examined this and determined that it is a very simple payment method, that there is no need to write any rules for it, and that ultimately it is just a method involving the shipment of goods and payment by remittance, so they did not feel the need to establish any rules for it. That is why the cash against goods method is such a method. It is also one of the most widely used methods in the world. It is preferred because it is very simple, even though other methods are more secure. For example, a letter of credit is a very secure, very good, and very reliable payment method. The use of cash against goods is much more common. In other words, while letters of credit are used in about 11 or 12% of world trade, the cash against goods payment method can be used in more than 80% of cases. The reason for this is that it is supported by additional guarantees. That is why we need to understand this method in this way. Another payment method we have is what we call payment against documents. In payment against documents, the goods are again prepared and shipped by the seller. Of course, before that, the contract must state that the payment method is payment against documents. After it is stated, the seller prepares and ships the goods and submits the documents required for the goods to be cleared from customs to a bank for collection purposes. That bank then takes these documents and sends them to the buyer's bank. Normally, the buyer's bank is supposed to hold these documents in its possession. It must notify the buyer. Accordingly, the buyer should come, pay the amount, or if there is a bill of exchange attached, accept the bill, take the documents, and then go to customs to clear the goods. We call this method payment against documents or collection. Now, of course, this method also has some risks and possibilities for fraud. It is necessary to pay attention to these. It is one of the least used payment methods in the world, because cases of fraud can occur very frequently with this method. There are documents involved. What we call vesaik are documents. In other words, these are the invoice showing the goods have been sold, the transport document showing the goods have been shipped, and other related documents. We refer to all of these collectively as vesaik. Vesaik means documents in Ottoman Turkish. So, after a company ships the goods, after sending them, what does it do with the documents that represent those goods and are used to claim them? It gives them to a bank, along with an instruction for collection purposes. The exporter's bank takes these documents and sends them to the buyer's bank. The buyer's bank also acts as an intermediary for the collection. After collecting the payment, it takes the money and sends it to the seller's bank. The seller's bank then pays this amount to the seller, and the buyer receives the documents from the collecting bank. The buyer then uses these documents to claim the goods. In this way, the transaction is completed. However, as I mentioned, the documents may be in transit with the courier or at the bank. Since these documents, depending on the situation, may represent the goods themselves, they must not fall into the hands of malicious individuals. What happens if they do? They could go and take the goods and disappear. Because of such risks, this payment method is used a bit less frequently. But basically, documents against payment is this kind of payment method. There is no bank guarantee. The documents are submitted to the bank. The bank uses them for collection, but even if the collection is not made, it does not provide any guarantee or assurance regarding the payment. Instead, in order to eliminate the buyer's risk and to provide a bank guarantee, the payment method called a letter of credit is used. The payment method we call a letter of credit is one of the best, most reliable, and most effective payment methods in the world. With this, a seller can easily send goods anywhere in the world and receive payment from there. Of course, the payment will be received not from the customer, but from the bank. In other words, it is a payment method in which the bank is involved and provides a guarantee. With this method, a company can send goods anywhere in the world, can also buy goods from anywhere in the world, and can easily conduct trade in every region. It can be used domestically as well as internationally. There are also advantages for the buyer. The buyer is assured of which documents they will receive. The buyer determines them, and a letter of credit is issued according to the conditions set by the buyer. And the seller uses this letter of credit to ship the goods and receives payment under its terms. To elaborate a bit more, what is a letter of credit? A letter of credit is, in essence, a letter issued by the buyer's bank to the seller on behalf of the buyer, and this letter contains specific conditions. What are these conditions? There are payment terms, such as how much will be paid. Then there are documents, the required documents. Which documents the seller must present after shipment, and that the seller can receive payment based on those documents. All of this is written in that letter. Ultimately, it is a letter prepared by the buyer's bank, and this letter, through the bank, again through the seller's bank, which we call the advising bank. We call the buyer's bank the bank that issues the letter of credit, the issuing bank. The issuing bank sends the letter of credit it has issued to the advising bank, which is the seller's bank. The advising bank receives this and notifies the seller. The seller carefully reads the letter received, because by fulfilling the conditions stated there, they will receive their payment and they will ship the goods according to those conditions. The seller needs to carry out all these steps very thoroughly, and for this, they need to know the rules of the letter of credit. They need to know the technical aspects of the letter of credit. If they do not know these things, they must definitely work with an expert and acquire knowledge on this subject. If the person using the letter of credit is familiar with it and believes they can fulfill its conditions, then they prepare the goods. They ship according to the terms of the letter of credit, take the documents, and deliver them to the bank. The bank examines these documents. If the documents are in order, there are also the rules that the letter of credit is subject to. The UCP rules. The UCP rules are regulations written by the ICC for letters of credit. In fact, although we haven't mentioned it, in the context of documents against payment, there are also the URC, Uniform Rules for Collections, or more commonly known as ICC Publication number 522, which are written by the ICC for documents against payment. They are also a company. When a company submits collection documents to its bank, it writes under the collection instruction that it is subject to ICC Publication number 522 rules and submits it that way. Yes, after adding the part we forgot about documents against payment in this way, let's continue with our section on letters of credit. Letters of credit, on the other hand, have rules called UCP, Uniform Customs and Practices, and these are also rules written by the ICC. In addition to these UCP rules, there are also rules called ISBP. These too have been written by the International Chamber of Commerce, that is the ICC. There are 39 articles in the UCP. These are rules that explain the responsibilities and obligations of the letter of credit, the status of the documents, and the characteristics of the documents. In other words, without knowing or applying these, if we are not familiar with these rules, we cannot use a letter of credit. So in order to use a letter of credit, you first need to know the technique of the letter of credit. You need to know how a letter of credit works. In addition, you need to know the rules. You need to know two things. One, you need to know how a letter of credit operates, its technique, and two, you need to know the rules. And in this way, you can use a letter of credit. A letter of credit is actually not a very difficult or complex structure. The technique of a letter of credit is extremely simple. I will explain that in a moment. In the rules, there are ultimately 39 articles. In those articles, who is responsible for what? These are statements that explain these responsibilities. They are paragraphs and conditions that explain these matters, and once we learn these, there is nothing difficult left about it. In addition to this, there is also what we call ISBP, which is the International Standard Banking Practice. That too is a set of rules annexed to the UCP. We also need to know about these. Now, when it comes to the technique of the letter of credit, we need to elaborate on it a bit. The technique of the letter of credit is as follows. The parties to the contract specify that the payment method will be a letter of credit. After stating that it will be a letter of credit, the buyer instructs their bank to open a letter of credit. We call this instruction an application form or an offer form. In the offer form, the buyer company clearly and explicitly specifies all the documents and requirements they need. They submit this to the bank and the bank evaluates it. The bank checks the credits. Does that company have credit at that bank or not? The bank checks this. If there is a credit line and the conditions provided, as well as the information given in the offer form, are suitable for the bank decides to open the letter of credit. And there is a method in banks called SWIFT. It is an online system that operates between banks. One of the message types there is reserved for letters of credit. The bank prepares a SWIFT message in the MT700 format, which is what we call the SWIFT format. It transfers all the information obtained from the offer form into the MT700 SWIFT format. Thus, in the MT700 format, that is, in the SWIFT format, the bank has a text in hand. This text is the letter of credit text. The bank takes the letter of credit text and notifies the seller through a bank, specifically through the seller's bank. The seller examines this text and checks all the conditions in this text one by one. After deciding that they can fulfill these conditions, they prepare the goods, ship them, and submit their documents to the bank according to the letter of credit text. The bank examines these documents. It must review them within 5 days. It must review them within 5 banking business days. If these documents are found to be in order within 5 banking business days, then the bank is obliged to make the payment. There will be no further dealings between the buyer and the seller. They submit the documents to the bank and receive the payment from the bank. This is very similar to the credit cards we use in our daily lives. In other words, a seller delivers goods to a buyer, but then where do they go to get the money? They get it from the bank. The situation here is exactly the same. After that, the bank makes the payment. But if the documents are not in order, then the bank does not make the payment. What does it do for the company? It sends a letter indicating that the documents have been rejected, and in that letter it specifies in which respects the documents were not compliant. For example, there is no signature on the invoice. There is no carrier company listed on the transport document. What are such issues actually? These are non-compliant situations, and if such a situation occurs, the bank does not make the payment, and thus the seller cannot benefit from the letter of credit. Here, we call these non-compliant points or issues discrepancies. So, when a company says, "My documents received a discrepancy at the bank," it actually means that those documents were reviewed under the letter of credit at the bank and were found to be non-compliant. The letter of credit method, in its most basic form, works like this. Of course, risk management is also important here. With a letter of credit, a company manages its risk, it eliminates the buyer's risk, and here, the buyer's own bank provides a guarantee to the seller. In this way, the seller eliminates their buyer risk. Why? Because the counterparty will be the buyer's bank. In fact, if the seller considers the buyer's bank or even the buyer's country to be risky, if they calculate these as risks for themselves, if they come to this conclusion, then it is also possible for them to eliminate these risks as well. In that case, they can obtain the guarantee of a bank in their own country for that letter of credit. We call this confirmation. Thus, if they obtain confirmation from a bank, they will be using a confirmed letter of credit. With confirmation, they also eliminate the country risk and the issuing bank risk. In short, this means, according to the letter of credit, they will ship the goods, and the confirming bank, which is usually a nearby bank in their own country, they will go to that bank, submit the documents, and if the documents are in order, they will receive their payment there. In the end, a letter of credit is a payment method like this. That's why a letter of credit can be used in both foreign and domestic trade. It can be used within the country as well as abroad. We strongly recommend using letters of credit. If all trade were conducted through letters of credit, it would be a situation that could easily protect both parties. In addition to this, there are supplementary guarantees. These are, for example, standbys, letters of guarantee, and guarantees. These are simply standard letters of guarantee. They are commitments issued by a bank on behalf of a customer, guaranteeing the performance of a task or the payment of an obligation. If someone is to benefit from such a commitment, then the other party's bank undertakes the commitment for its customer and provides this commitment to the addressee in the form of a letter. And what happens to the addressee in this case? They are able to conduct business by using that commitment. We call this a letter of guarantee. To give a very simple example, let's say there is a buyer company and a seller company. The seller company is not sure that the payment will be made. So what do? They may ask the buyer company to provide them with a letter of guarantee. The buyer company can also go to its bank and request that a letter of guarantee be issued to the seller. If the buyer's bank prepares a letter of guarantee and gives it to the seller for payment, the situation is as follows. The seller, trusting this, ships the goods. If the money does not arrive, under that guarantee, under that letter of guarantee, the seller goes to the bank and demands the payment. When making the claim, the seller declares that they have shipped the goods and that the payment has not been received and requests the payment for the goods. In fact, guarantees and guarantee letters are the same thing. Guarantees and letters of guarantee are the instruments, the products used for this purpose. A standby is also the same as a letter of guarantee. It is just the American practice. It is a commitment, a method used by countries influenced by America. Its operation is somewhat similar to a letter of credit, but the function it serves is exactly the same as a letter of guarantee. At one time, issuing guarantees was prohibited in America. Instead, they developed a product called a standby, and this is still in use today. Even though it doesn't have much significance today, because banks in America can now also issue guarantees. However, since it is a mature product and has been used for many years, it still exists in our commercial life. We can also use this as always, anytime, anywhere. If we know these technical details and the ecosystem of foreign trade, there will be no obstacles to conducting trade. Basically, knowing these things is sufficient for foreign trade. Thank you for listening. Hello friends. Here, I would like to give a brief overview about the CDCS Letter of Credit Specialist Certificate, the International Letter of Credit Specialist Certificate. The Letter of Credit Specialist Certificate has become an extremely prestigious document. It first emerged in 1999. At that time, the idea of creating such a certificate was considered, and we called it the CDCS certificate. It first originated in England, in London. It is a certificate organized, conducted, and arranged by a company whose name at the time was IFS, now known as LEF. It is awarded every year. The exam for this is held twice a year. As I mentioned, it has been conducted since 1999. It has now become a certificate that has truly proven itself. It has become a certificate recognized all over the world. In other words, it is accepted that someone who holds this certificate carries out letter of credit operations at a world-class standard and is proficient in letters of credit. Now, in order to obtain this certificate, you need to apply. There is a fee and you need to pay it. In fact, the fee is £730 sterling. If you are not successful and take the exam again, then you will have to pay a fee of around £350 sterling. As a result, after you register, they send you a book. You need to study that book. It is an English language book. Of course, having experience is also recommended. At least 1 or 2 years of experience, or even 2 or 3 years of experience is recommended, because there will also be practical questions in the exam. The exam consists of 2 parts. In the first part of this exam, basic concepts, contractual, amder sebi konde, kımanda sandaza, itimburi.